For this lecture session, we'll be discussing about urine formation. When we talk about urine formation, this is basically the three important processes done by the kidneys, namely filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. Okay, when we talk about excretion, this is typically the sum of these three processes: filtration minus reabsorption plus secretion. So these three processes, they pertain to how substances are being handled by the kidney. So when we talk about renal handling of a particular substance, this is simply these three processes: filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. So for example, if you look at substance A, no? How is substance A being handled? Substance A here is simply filtered. It is not secreted. It is not reabsorbed. So when you get a urine sample, of course, substance A will be present in your urine. A classic example of this would be inulin. For substance B, it is filtered, and some of it will have to be reabsorbed. No? Now, not all of them will be reabsorbed completely, such that if you get a urine sample, substance B will still be present in the urine. Typical examples of these would be your electrolytes, sodium, chloride, calcium, etc. For substance C, this is filtered, but then it has to be reabsorbed completely. So you have 100% reabsorption. So if you get a urine sample, substance C will not be present. Classic example of this would be glucose and amino acids. For substance D, it is filtered. Now, some of it will be left in the blood vessels. Now, this substance will have to be secreted by the renal tubules. In the same manner, if you get a urine sample, substance D will also be present. Classic example of this would be the various organic acids and bases being produced by the body. So typically, these are waste products. Now, I'd like to make mention about creatinine. Now, if you read your books, creatinine, some books would say it is filtered, not secreted, not reabsorbed. So basically, creatinine or the handling of creatinine is simply filtration only. Now, some books will say this is a reflection of the glomerular filtration rate, which we will discuss later on. But many books would still claim that creatinine or some creatinine will have to be secreted. So it may behave similarly like substance D. Okay, so now we'll go to the first process. So this is glomerular filtration. So this is being done by the renal corpuscle. So here you have the glomerulus and of course the Bowman's space. So this is where filtration will occur. So if you will recall, in the glomerulus, you have a relatively high hydrostatic pressure. So this will drive the plasma or the fluid, through your filtration barrier. And the filtrate will be collected by the Bowman's capsule. So looking at the layers of your filtration barrier, we'll go now from the blood side to the filtrate side. So the first layer would be the capillary endothelium. So in the diagram here, you will note that the capillary endothelium will have fenestrations. So because of these fenestrations, the permeability of the filtration barrier is much, much higher compared to your regular capillary bed. The next layer would be the basement membrane. And the outermost layer facing the filtrate or the Bowman's space would be your Bowman's epithelium. Now, this Bowman's epithelium will have slit pores. So because of the properties of the filtration barrier, the glomerulus is said to be 100 times more permeable than your capillaries. Now, an interesting property of the filtration barrier is that it has a lot of negatively charged particles, particularly collagen and proteoglycans. So because of these negatively charged particles, not all of your substances in the plasma will be filtered, particularly plasma proteins. So these proteins are also negatively charged. So because of their charges, your plasma proteins will not be readily filtered, such that if you get a sample of your filtrate from the Bowman's space, now the filtrate is said to be similar or identical to plasma, except it will not contain 4 plasma proteins. So plasma concentrations of glucose, electrolytes, and all the various substances will be nearly identical, no? When you compare the filtrate with your plasma. Now, the Gibbs-Donan effect is also observed because of these negative charges present in the filtration barrier. So because of this negative charge, you will slightly observe that there are more positively charged particles, coming through, and you have less negatively charged particles that are being filtered. So because of the repulsion of your electrical charges, the Gibbs-Donan effect may be observed. So in this diagram, you will note the filtration barrier again. So we'll go from the blood side to the filtrate side. So again, the first layer would be your capillary endothelium. So these are the fenestrations observed in the capillary endothelium. And from there, you have your glomerular basement membrane. Now take note that your glomerular basement membrane is composed of several layers, namely the lamina rara externa, lamina densa, and lamina rara interna. Now these layers would contain numerous proteins and connective tissue that will impart negative charge. Now the outermost portion would be the Bowman's epithelium. So these are your epithelial cells, and in between them you have your slit pores. So these slit pores will also increase the permeability of your filtration barrier. Now, you will also observe here you have your foot processes. Now, these foot processes interdigitate. When they interdigitate, they will form now your slit diaphragms. So if you look at this diagram, so here you can see the various proteins present in the Bowman's epithelium. So all of these proteins will also impart a negative charge on the filtration barrier. So because of the properties of your filtration barrier, you have two important factors that will determine filterability, namely the size of your molecule and the charge of your molecule. So if you look at the table here, generally, the greater the size of your molecule, the filterability increases. So if you look at water, its filterability is 1 or 100%. If you increase the molecular size to, let's say you have myoglobin, myoglobin would have a filterability of 0.75 or it is 75% filtered. If you further increase the size of the molecule like albumin, so the filterability further decreases. So you will note that large proteins present in the blood or your plasma proteins, they are generally not being filtered. Now, one of its determining factor would be its size. So this is due to the fenestrations and the slit pores present in the filtration barrier. So of course, if you are not able to fit through the pores, then you will not be filtered. The second important determinant would be the charge. So because of the negative charge present in the filtration barrier, you will note that negatively charged particles will not be filtered. So if you look at the graph here, so here you have dextran. Given a specific weight for dextran, let's say 30 angstroms, the red line here or the red graph here would represent polycationic dextran. The blue one is neutral. The black one is anionic or negatively charged. So you will notice that because of the negative charge of your filtration barrier, positively charged and neutral dextran can be easily filtered. So they will have a higher filterability compared to a negatively charged dextran. So you have repulsion now of your negatively charged particles. So these are the two factors that determine filterability. First, you have the charge. And secondly, you have the molecular size or molecular weight. Now, when we talk about filtration, the mesangial cells will have an important role in regulating filtration rate. So in this diagram, the darkly colored cells will represent the mesangial cells. Now, these mesangial cells will have phagocytic properties. They are able to contract and they are able to produce vasoactive mediators. So when these mesangial cells produce your vasodilators or vasoconstrictors, they greatly affect the caliber of the afferent and the efferent arteriole. No? So being part of your juxtaglomerular apparatus, when the mesangial cells produce these vasoactive mediators, so they can either dilate or constrict your arterioles, they can now affect the hydrostatic pressure present in the glomerulus. Thus, they can affect the renal blood flow and influence glomerular filtration rate. Now, another property of your mesangial cells is that they have contractile properties. So they can either increase or decrease the total surface area of your filtration barrier. So the greater the surface area, the greater the Kf, then the greater your filtration rate becomes. So how do we now calculate for your glomerular filtration rate? Now, in order to determine your glomerular filtration rate, you have to take note of two things: your filtration coefficient and your effective filtering pressure. So let's look at the effective filtering pressure first. These are your Starling forces. These are your Starling forces. So typically, you have your glomerular hydrostatic pressure, which ranges from 60 to 100 millimeters mercury. So for purposes of discussion, let's go with 60 millimeters mercury. And your glomerular oncotic pressure, so this is due to the plasma proteins present in the glomerulus, that's typically around 32 millimeters mercury. So getting your effective filtering pressure, this is simply your pro-filtering factors minus your anti-filtering factors. So as the name implies, your pro-filtering factors, these are your glomerular hydrostatic pressure and your Bowman's oncotic pressure. So these Starling forces will promote filtration, whereas your Bowman's hydrostatic pressure and your glomerular oncotic pressure, these factors will prevent filtration or will oppose filtration. So these are the typical values for your Starling forces. So to get your effective filtering pressure, so this is simply your pro-filtering factors minus your anti-filtering factors, giving us a value of around 10 millimeters mercury. Now to calculate for your glomerular filtration rate, this is simply your Kf or your filtration coefficient, no? Times your effective filtering pressure. So again, your effective filtering pressure, these are your Starling forces. Now, the reflection coefficient of proteins, you also take into account of that, but it has been found out that the reflection coefficient of your plasma proteins is typically 1. So mathematically, it will not really affect the calculation for your glomerular filtration rate. So as an overview, the formula for your glomerular filtration rate is your filtration coefficient times your effective filtering pressure. Now, your filtration coefficient is dependent on two important factors. So this is simply your permeability and the surface area. So if you have a high permeability, then Kf is high. So the permeability for your filtration barrier is typically greater than that of your ordinary capillary bed. So this is due to the fenestrations and the slit pore. So these are properties of your filtration barrier. An example of alteration in your permeability, no, which will affect glomerular filtration rate, would be glomerulonephritis. So when you have inflammation of the filtration barrier, so the filtration barrier becomes inflamed, so it thickens, then the permeability decreases. So the KF goes down, then filtration rate goes down. So this is the reason why oliguria is being observed in patients with glomerulonephritis. The second factor would be surface area. So typically, the greater the surface area, the greater the KF. And the greater the KF, the greater your glomerular filtration rate is. An example for your surface area would be partial nephrectomy. So when you remove a portion of the kidney, so a good number of nephrons will be removed from the kidney. So the total surface area of the filtration barrier decreases. So KF goes down, filtration rate would typically go down. Now, I've included here the mesangial cell activity because your mesangial cells can actually affect your surface area. And as what we have mentioned a while ago, the mesangial cells are able to produce vasoactive mediators that can also affect both KF and your effective filtering pressure by changing the caliber of your arterioles, your afferent and your efferent arterioles, depending on which type of vasoactive mediator is produced, then the Starling forces inside the glomerulus will be altered. Now, the KF is typically 12.5 ml per minute per millimeter mercury. So to get your glomerular filtration rate, you simply multiply your KF times your effective filtering pressure. So 125 ml per minute is the typical glomerular filtration rate. These are the filtration rates for males and for females. Now, in the clinics, classically, it is important for us to determine the glomerular filtration rate of our patients because this will tell us the relative renal function of our patient. So it is important that we more or less determine the glomerular filtration rate. So if you look at this diagram here, this will show to us the relative amounts of healthy nephrons present in a particular patient. So of course, typically if GFR is 100%, then you can surmise that more or less there is little to no renal injury. But if you will notice, as GFR or glomerular filtration rate decreases, no, you can easily classify your renal function as risk, injury, or failure. So that's the importance of determining glomerular filtration rate. No? It helps us classify the renal function of our patients. Now, classically, the clearance of inulin is the determinant or the gold standard in determining glomerular filtration rate. Now, inulin is a polysaccharide, so this is being administered to the patient. You allow it to go steady state for a while. Then using your clearance equation, you simply get the inulin concentration in the plasma and in the urine. So using your clearance equation, you can actually calculate for inulin. So this is the gold standard in determining glomerular filtration rate. So the clearance of inulin is said to be equal to your GFR. Now in the hospital or in the clinics, what we typically use is creatinine. No? If you read the more updated clinical books, so they will always mention that the clearance of creatinine is a good estimate for glomerular filtration rate. Now, interestingly, some of the physiology books, namely Guyton, they will say, or some of the chapters will say that creatinine is filtered, not secreted, not reabsorbed, similar to inulin. However, if you read further, they will make mention of creatinine being secreted. So how the kidneys handle creatinine will really depend on which book you're reading. But suffice it to say, in the clinics, we use the clearance for creatinine to estimate glomerular filtration rate. Okay, now let's look at your glomerular hydrostatic pressure and how does it affect your glomerular filtration rate. So for example, if you have these conditions, no, if arterial pressure changes, let's say arterial pressure would drop or arterial pressure would increase, what would happen to your glomerular filtration rate? In the same manner, if your afferent arteriole resistance increases, let's say the afferent arteriole constricts, what will happen to your filtration rate? And similarly, if your efferent arteriole constricts, what will happen to your glomerular filtration rate? For the first part, pertaining to arterial pressure, before you answer the question, you need to take note of your renal autoregulatory range. Some books will say it's 75 to 160 millimeters mercury. Some books will say it's 90 to 180 millimeters mercury. So this is your autoregulatory range, meaning if your arterial pressure fluctuates within this range, no, because of your renal autoregulatory mechanisms, renal blood flow and glomerular filtration rate is constant, or they are constant. So it should not change. So that's the first thing that should come into mind. Beyond this range, let's say less than 90 or greater than 180 millimeters mercury, GFR now becomes directly proportional to arterial pressure. So for example, when you have a patient that's suffering from hypovolemic shock, then arterial pressure drastically drops. Glomerular filtration rate will also drastically drop. So this is the reason why urine output of these patients, it's very, very minimal. For your afferent arteriole resistance, of course, if it constricts, this will decrease the hydrostatic pressure in the glomerulus. So that will decrease your glomerular filtration rate. Now, for your efferent arteriole, this is said to be biphasic. So depending on the degree of your constriction. So if you slightly constrict the efferent arteriole, blood is still allowed to flow through your efferent arteriole despite the constriction, then filtration rate increases. So this is due to the increase in the hydrostatic pressure within the glomerulus. So GFR goes up. However, if you maximally increase the resistance of your efferent arteriole, then glomerular filtration rate will decrease. Why? Because of the increased hydrostatic pressure, plasma proteins will now be concentrated within the glomerulus. So as filtration happens, there's now a steady increase in glomerular oncotic pressure. So as this oncotic pressure in the glomerulus increases, it will now prevent filtration. So it will attract fluid back to the glomerulus. Thus, if you maximally constrict your efferent arteriole, filtration rate drops, no? Because of the high concentration of your plasma proteins. Now, talking about the plasma proteins and how it is being concentrated in the glomerulus, filtration fraction will give you an estimate of this. So to calculate for your filtration fraction, this is simply your glomerular filtration rate divided by your renal plasma flow. So if filtration rate increases, but if your renal plasma flow remains constant or the same, then your filtration fraction increases. Meaning to say, the plasma proteins are now being concentrated. And as plasma proteins in the glomerulus are being concentrated, then your glomerular oncotic pressure increases now. Now, normally, the value for your filtration fraction is 0.2. This simply means that as your blood is filtered, or as plasma is being filtered from the afferent side to the efferent side, no? Plasma will be filtered. What is left in the glomerulus would be your plasma proteins. So here you will note that as plasma passes through your glomerulus from the afferent side to the efferent side, plasma is being filtered, but proteins will be left in the glomerulus. So take note, the filtration fraction increases now, meaning your plasma proteins are slowly being concentrated. So if you have a filtration fraction, which is normally 0.2 or 20%, so this means that 20% of plasma is being filtered, or it goes through the filtration barrier. Now the other 80% will now go through your efferent arteriole into the peritubular capillaries or vasa recta. So if you have a higher filtration fraction, let's say 0.5 for purposes of discussion, so 0.5. So this means that 50% of plasma is filtered. So it goes through the filtration barrier, and the other 50% will go through the efferent arteriole into the peritubular capillaries or your vasa recta. So notice that the filtration fraction with a higher value, let's say 0.5, this means that your plasma proteins are more concentrated. So the higher the filtration fraction is, the higher or the more concentrated your plasma proteins become. Okay, now let's talk about the second process, which is reabsorption. So after filtration happens, your filtrate will now be collected in the Bowman's space. Now, like what we've said, the filtrate is identical to plasma, except it will not contain plasma proteins. Now, this filtrate will pass through the tubules. Now, as this filtrate goes through the tubules, it will undergo the second process, namely tubular reabsorption. Now, reabsorption is typically selective. So the reabsorption rate is around 124 ml per minute. So later on, we'll see how this value is being derived. Now, reabsorption is said to be selective, unlike filtration. So for filtration, it's said to be non-selective for as long as the molecular weight permits it or the charge of the molecule permits it, then this substance will be filtered. However, for reabsorption, the renal tubules will select which of the substances will have to be brought back to the body. Now, in order to underline the importance of reabsorption, because of reabsorption, our urine output would typically be 0.5 to 1 cc per kilogram per hour, or around 1 to 1.5 liters per day. If reabsorption will not happen, urine output would be as high as 178 liters per day, which is physiologically impossible. So this will deprive the body of so much water. Now in this table, here you have the various substances that are typically found in the plasma and how they are being handled by the kidney. So notice that your glucose is 100% reabsorbed. For your electrolytes, no, like what we've discussed earlier, they will be filtered and majority of them will have to be reabsorbed. But if you get a urine sample, these electrolytes are still present in your urine, like your sodium, chloride, potassium, etc. Okay. So when we talk about tubular reabsorption, you have two important mechanisms how this happens. You have your active transport and your passive transport. So let's discuss passive transport first. So if you will recall, your passive transport, of course, will not require ATP or energy. So this will only depend on the electrochemical osmotic or osmotic gradient present in the tubules. So this is how water, urea, and chloride are being handled. Now, under active transport, of course, these will utilize energy or ATP. You have three important processes: TM or transport maxima, gradient time limitation, and pinocytosis. So the simplest concept would be pinocytosis. So this is how some polypeptides are being handled. So your polypeptides or your small proteins, will attach to a particular receptor, and then it will be engulfed by the tubular cells. The second is TM or transport maxima. So these are the different substances that are being handled by your TM or transport maxima. So these are carrier dependent, no? And glucose and amino acids are classic examples of substances wherein TM is being exhibited. Since they are carrier dependent, certain properties will have to be observed, like for example, saturation. So when you saturate your receptors, let's say for example, your glucose carriers, your SGLT1 or SGLT2 transporters, your GLUT1 or GLUT2 transporters, then your reabsorption rate becomes constant at maximum. So any concentrations that will exceed your transport maxima, meaning you saturate your carriers, they will no longer be reabsorbed. No? So glucose now goes out into the urine. So you have now glucosuria. Classic example of this would be your uncontrolled diabetes mellitus. The third process is your gradient time limitation. So recall that the filtrate is always in contact with your tubular cells. Now, sodium and bicarb are being handled via gradient time limitation. So you have two factors that will determine the rate of transport. First, you have the gradient established. So of course, the higher the gradient, the faster the rate of reabsorption. So for example, if the filtered load of sodium is high compared to the sodium found inside your tubular cell, then the rate of reabsorption increases. So the higher the gradient, the faster the rate of reabsorption. The second factor is the time wherein the fluid is in contact with the epithelium. So if you have a certain amount of fluid that is in contact with your tubular cells for longer periods of time, then this will give time for the transporters to pick up these substances. So for example, when you have the filtrate flowing very, very slowly through the tubules, so this will give time for your sodium transporters, your SGLT transporters, to pick up sodium. So of course, if you have more time, then the tubular cell will reabsorb more sodium. So this is your gradient time limitation. Okay, so to quantify the amount of being reabsorbed, so this is now the formula. No? So if your filtered load is greater than your excretion rate, this simply means that reabsorption has occurred. So for example, let's look at glucose. If the plasma glucose concentration, let's say, is 120 milligrams per dl, then this would be the concentration of glucose inside the Bowman's space. So remember, the filtrate is similar to your plasma, except it will not contain proteins. So just the same, the filtrate in the Bowman's space will have around the same amount of glucose. No? Let's say 120 milligrams per dl. But if you get the urine sample, you should find 0 glucose there. So of course, 120 is greater than 0. Therefore, glucose must have been reabsorbed. And these are the factors that will affect tubular reabsorption. So number one is flow rate. The faster the flow rate, rate of reabsorption decreases. No? This is particularly true for your gradient time limitation. The higher the osmotic pressure of the filtrate, reabsorption increases. No? So if you have a greater osmotic pressure, or sorry, let's backtrack a little. If the osmotic pressure of the filtrate is high, then reabsorption decreases. No? Meaning to say, you have so many osmolytes or osmotically active particles present in the filtrate. So they will now draw water, no, into your tubular lumen. So reabsorption decreases. And the third factor would be hormones. So you have a lot of hormones that can affect reabsorption of not just water, but various substances as well, like your electrolytes. No? So classic examples would be your ADH, aldosterone, natriuretic peptides, angiotensin. So they basically affect handling of sodium and water. You also have PTH, vitamin D, and calcitonin, important for the handling of your phosphate and calcium. No? Okay. Now, just like filtration, we can also calculate for your reabsorption rate. Now, if you look at the formula, it is similar to your glomerular filtration rate. So this is also your filtration coefficient multiplied by your net reabsorptive force, or your Starling forces. However, if you will inspect closely, it is not actually the same formula. It's a totally different formula. So for your net reabsorptive force, this is typically your pro-reabsorptive factors minus your anti-reabsorptive factors. So here, you will note that your interstitial hydrostatic pressure and your peritubular capillary oncotic pressure, these two Starling forces will increase the rate of reabsorption. For your peritubular capillary hydrostatic pressure and your interstitial oncotic pressure, this will prevent reabsorption. And here are your values. So if you will notice, the values for your Starling forces is different, no, compared to your equation for filtration rate. So if you plug in the values, you also get a net reabsorptive force of 10 millimeters mercury. Now, the filtration coefficient is also affected by the permeability of your barrier. So the filtration coefficient for your reabsorption is said to be around 12.4 ml per minute per millimeter mercury. So plugging in the values, reabsorption now is 124 ml per minute normally. So that's how we get the reabsorption rate. Now calculating for urine flow rate, this is simply your GFR, which is 125 ml per minute, the one we've calculated a while ago, minus your reabsorption rate, which is 124 ml per minute. Again, the one we've calculated a few seconds ago. So 125 minus 124 will get the urine flow rate, which is 1 ml per minute. Okay. Now let's look at how reabsorption happens as the filtrate goes through the renal tubules. So this diagram here is a summary on how the different processes occur with respect to reabsorption. So this is the tubular cell. This would be the filtrate. This would be the blood. So we will discuss now how reabsorption occurs. So at the basolateral side of the tubular cell, you have your sodium-potassium pump. So if you will recall, this is a primary pump that will drive sodium out and potassium in. So everything begins with your sodium-potassium pump. As your pump removes sodium out into the blood, it decreases now intracellular sodium. Looking at the filtrate, you have high concentrations of sodium present in the filtrate. So because of that, you establish now a gradient that will drive sodium into your tubular cell. So this is due to your concentration gradient. Now this sodium will enter the cell via a transporter or a carrier. Now interestingly, this transporter, which is a type of secondary active transport, is able to transport another substance, let's say X. So as your primary pump, no, drives sodium out into the blood, creating the gradient, that gradient will drive your secondary pump, driving now sodium in together with X. So notice that being a secondary active transport, sodium goes down a gradient, but substance X here goes against a gradient. So the concentration of X inside the cell increases. Now the concentration of X in the blood is relatively lower compared to your tubular cell. So take note that the blood is flowing here. So that gradient will drive X to utilize another transporter to go out into the blood. No? So that's how your X is being reabsorbed together with sodium. Now X here can represent a substance, let's say glucose. So if X here is glucose, then your secondary active transport here would be your SGLT. And your transporter here at the basolateral side would be your GLUT transporter. So glucose now is being reabsorbed. So if you want another substance, you have, let's say, your amino acids. So you have your amino acid importer, and then your amino acid will be pumped into the blood via a carrier. Now, sometimes X here can go via paracellular route. No? They can go via paracellular route. Similarly with Y. Y here will represent, let's say, an anion. No? So as sodium is being actively pumped into the blood, so that's a positive charge, so that will impart a relatively more negative filtrate and relatively more positive interstitial, no? Or more positive charge in the blood. So because of that gradient or electrochemical gradient, Y here, which would represent an anion, would also be reabsorbed. So let's say Y here would be chloride. So chloride now is being reabsorbed passively. No? So it is dependent on the electrochemical gradient. So X here is reabsorbed, sodium is reabsorbed, chloride is reabsorbed, or Y is reabsorbed. So you have your three osmotically active particles that will now attract water. Water now is reabsorbed via osmosis. So water is reabsorbed now passively. In the same way, as more water is being reabsorbed, the concentrations of your substances will increase, no? For X, sodium, and Y. So you have now a greater concentration as water is being reabsorbed. That will also facilitate faster reabsorption of these substances through your tubular cell. So they can go transcellularly, meaning through the cell membranes, no? As they go through or out to the blood, or they can go paracellularly between tubular cells. So you have their tight junctions. Now, sometimes, no, substances can go out from the blood back to your filtrate. So this is termed your backleak. So we'll discuss more of this later on. So typically, those are the processes by which reabsorption takes place. Now we'll go through the different segments of the nephron. No? So follow now the flow of the filtrate. So coming from the Bowman's space, the filtrate will pass through the proximal convoluted tubule. Now the proximal convoluted tubule is divided into the early PCT and the late PCT. Now, in the early PCT, this is where majority of your water and your electrolytes are being reabsorbed. So around 65 to 67% of the filtered substances, no? Water, sodium, chloride, and potassium, around 65 to 67% of these will be reabsorbed in the early proximal convoluted tubule. So again, everything begins with your sodium-potassium pump. So this would be the blood, this would be the filtrate. So similarly, like what we've discussed, your primary pump will generate the concentration gradient necessary for your secondary pump to occur. So here in this example, sodium is reabsorbed with glucose. So that's your SGLT transporter or SGLT2 transporter. Sodium will go out into the blood via your sodium-potassium pump, and your glucose will go back into the blood via your GLUT2 transporter. Now, the mechanism for these various transporters would be similar. Now, in the early PCT, this is also where pinocytosis of your polypeptides will occur. Now, in the late PCT, this is where your chloride and water would be reabsorbed. No? So again, so this is your blood. This would be the filtrate. So everything starts with your sodium-potassium pump, creating the gradient. So here you have your sodium-hydrogen antiporter. So that will, or your primary pump will drive sodium in and hydrogen out. So take note, hydrogen is being secreted here. Once hydrogen is present in the filtrate, it will combine with an anion. Now this anion, since it is neutral now, it can easily enter the cell membrane. Now your hydrogen and your anion will dissociate. So your hydrogen will be pumped out again via your hydrogen or sodium hydrogen antiporter, and your anion will be pumped out into the filtrate via a chloride anion antiporter. So as your anion goes out, chloride enters. No? So again, these transporters are being powered by your sodium-potassium pump. So they serve as your secondary active transport mechanisms. So once chloride is inside the cell, it can go out via a potassium chloride symporter. Or typically, chloride can pass through paracellularly, no? Or it can be reabsorbed paracellularly. And together with your chloride, this is also where water is being reabsorbed. Now here, water can be reabsorbed through aquaporates. So it can go through your tubular cell. So that's transcellular reabsorption. Or it can go in between your cells. You have paracellular reabsorption. Now, sometimes solutes can also be carried by water. So you have there your solvent graph. Now, around 65 to 67% of the filtered water will be reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule. So majority of the filtered substances is reabsorbed in the PCT, or majority of water is being reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule. Now, as a general rule, no, your glucose, amino acids, electrolytes, water, some of your polypeptides, most, if not all of them, are being reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule. Now we enter the loop of Henle. Now, as the filtrate enters the loop of Henle, this filtrate is still said to be isotonic. So the reabsorption in the proximal convoluted tubule, you have equal amounts or isoosmotic reabsorption of your fluid and your substances. So As the filtrate enters the loop of Henle, it is still isotonic. Now we go through the descending limb of the loop of Henle. Now in the thin descending limb, only water is being reabsorbed. Now this is particularly true for juxtamedullary nephrons, since the loop of Henle enters hypertonic region in the medulla. No? The thin descending limb, which contains numerous aquaporins, no, this will drive water to be reabsorbed from the filtrate. No, only water is being reabsorbed in the descending limb of the loop of Henle. So with that, the concentration of the filtrate now gradually increases. Then it goes up the ascending limb. In the ascending limb, take note that only solutes are being reabsorbed. Only solutes are being reabsorbed. Now, the ascending limb is further subdivided into two: the thin ascending limb and the thick ascending limb. So in the thin ascending limb, you have passive reabsorption of substances. So take note that as the filtrate passes through the hairpin loop of the loop of Henle and it goes into the thin ascending limb, the concentration of the filtrate is high. So this will favor passive reabsorption of electrolytes or substances. As it goes up the thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle, active reabsorption occurs. So in this diagram, you need to take note of one important transporter. So this is the NKCC2 transporter. Again, this is being powered by your sodium-potassium pump. Now, your sodium-potassium pump will create a sodium gradient that will favor reabsorption of sodium. Together with sodium, your NKCC2 transporter, which is a secondary active transport, can also reabsorb potassium and 2 chloride ions. So let's follow these substances now. Sodium, once it enters the tubular cell, will be pumped out into the blood or reabsorbed into the blood via your sodium-potassium pump. Chloride can go out into the blood via a potassium chloride co-transporter. For potassium, as it gradually increases its concentration inside the cell, can either go out into the blood via your potassium chloride co-transporter, or it can go back out into the filtrate via a potassium leak channel. When potassium goes out into the filtrate, this is now your back leak. Since potassium leaks out into the filtrate, this will now impart a positive charge on the filtrate. This positive charge will create an electric gradient that will favor reabsorption of other cations passing through Claudin-16. So in this diagram, it can go via paracellular route going through your Claudin-16. So this is typically how calcium and magnesium are being reabsorbed in the thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle. So take note, in the ascending limb, only solutes are being reabsorbed. This will make your filtrate now hypotonic. Now we enter the distal convoluted tubule. Now the distal convoluted tubule is also divided into two segments. You have the early DCT and the late DCT. In the early DCT, you will only observe their reabsorption of sodium chloride. Water will not be reabsorbed. So your sodium chloride symporter will be powered again by your primary pump. So following now your ion, sodium goes into the cell via your sodium chloride symporter, then out into the blood via your sodium-potassium pump. Your chloride goes in via your secondary pump, then out into the blood via a chloride channel. Again, take note, only solutes are being reabsorbed. water will not be reabsorbed. So because of this, the early segment of your DCT will further dilute your filtrate. So together with the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, no, they will now comprise the diluting segment of the nephron. So your early DCT together with the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, this is the diluting segment of the nephron. Now we go to the late distal convoluted tubule and collecting ducts. So take note, the filtrate now is hypotonic as it enters or as it passes through these segments. Now in the late DCT and collecting ducts, this is where final modification of the urine happens. So depending on the needs of the body, certain hormones, no, can affect the reabsorption rate of certain substances. So for example, if ADH is present, this is where ADH will increase the reabsorption of water now. So with the presence of ADH, the late DCT and your collecting tubules will reabsorb 8 to 17% of the filtered water. So depending on the need of the body. Now, this is also where aldosterone will exert its effect. So aldosterone will promote reabsorption of sodium, and together with sodium, you have water. Now, in order to understand the effect of aldosterone on these segments, we need to discuss two important cells present in these segments, namely the principal cells and the intercalated cells. So in this diagram, this is your principal cell, this is your intercalated cell. Your principal cell will primarily determine the handling of sodium, water, and potassium. So this is the filtrate, this is the blood. So this is again your sodium-potassium pump. So if you will notice, as you increase the activity of your sodium-potassium pump, you create a sodium gradient that will promote sodium reabsorption. No? So sodium enters the cell and then out into the blood via your sodium-potassium pump. Similarly, potassium is being secreted by the principal cell. No? As your pump increases its activity, the potassium concentration inside the cell will increase, so that will favor secretion of potassium out into the filtrate. So your principal cells will primarily reabsorb sodium in exchange for potassium. When aldosterone is present, aldosterone will increase the activity and number of your sodium-potassium pump in the principal cells. So having said that, if aldosterone is present, that will increase sodium reabsorption, and of course together with that is water. Potassium secretion also increases. So when you have hyperaldosteronism, expect your patient to be hypertensive and potassium in the plasma will be low, or you have hypokalemia. Now let's look at your intercalated cells. Now your intercalated cells are important for acid-base balance. So generally you have two types. You have your alpha intercalated cell and your beta intercalated cell. Your alpha intercalated cell will secrete hydrogen. Your beta intercalated cell will secrete bicarb. But for this example, this is your alpha intercalated cell, which secretes hydrogen. Okay. Now the activity of your intercalated cell has a close relationship with your principal cell. Why? Other than your hydrogen pump, you also have another pump, which is your potassium hydrogen antiporter. So again, this is a primary active transport. And this is dependent on the presence of potassium. So for example, when you have hyperaldosteronism, you further increase secretion of potassium. So the potassium in the filtrate increases, which is now available for your potassium hydrogen antiporter. So more and more of potassium will be pumped in, more and more hydrogen is pumped out. That's why when you have hyperaldosteronism, not only will you have hypokalemia, you will also have increased secretion of hydrogen ions. Thus, you will have metabolic alkalosis. Okay, now let's go to the third process, which is tubular secretion. Now, basically, the mechanisms or the principles behind tubular secretion is almost identical with tubular reabsorption. The only main difference is the direction of the movement of your substances would be opposite. So any substance with a greater concentration, no, compared to inulin is said to be secreted. So if you look at this table, here you have the clearance rate of the various substances. No? So inulin will have a clearance rate of 125 ml per minute. So again, take note, this is reflective of glomerular filtration rate, no? 125 ml per minute. So notice that your glucose and electrolytes, no, would have a clearance rate much less compared to inulin. So this means that these substances are being reabsorbed. But if your clearance rate is greater than inulin, let's say creatinine, no, this means that that substance is secreted. Now, just like reabsorption, you have two main processes by which secretion happens. You have active secretion and passive secretion. So as the name implies, when you have active secretion, you utilize ATP. No? Again, this is primarily driven by your pumps, and certain properties will be exhibited. Like for example, transport maxima. So similarly, PM with respect to secretion will also observe saturation of your carriers. So these are the different substances that are being handled via transport maximum. Such that if you have so much of these substances that needs to be secreted to the point where carriers, no, are being saturated, then rate of secretion becomes constant at maximum. Any concentrations higher than that, no, you will not be able to secrete it. So it stays in the body. For your gradient time limitation, this is how hydrogen and potassium are being handled or being secreted. So as the name implies, again, they are dependent on the concentration gradient and the time wherein the filtrate is in contact with the epithelium. No? And lastly, you have passive secretion. So as the name implies, it will not utilize energy and they are dependent on electrochemical or concentration gradient. Now, under passive secretion, you have diffusion trapping. No? This is how weak acids and weak bases are being handled, or organic acids and bases are being handled. Okay, so we'll discuss this in detail shortly. Okay, so how does secretion happen? So if you look at this diagram, so again, this is your tubular cell. This is the filtrate. This would be the blood. So we will now discuss how secretion occurs. So just like reabsorption, everything begins with your primary pump. No? So your pump is typically located on the basolateral surface. So in this case, your pump here will drive sodium out into the blood and some other substance, let's say X, no, into your tubular cell. So that will drive sodium from the filtrate into your cell, then out into the blood via your pump. But your substance X here will enter the cell. The concentration inside the cell increases, creating a gradient. So this is now a carrier that will drive X out into the filtrate. No? So X here could be an organic acid or base. No? or any substance or metabolite that must be secreted. We'll have examples later on. Or substance X can typically use a carrier, no? Or a transporter here. Now for your diffusion trapping, this is how organic acids and bases or weak acids and bases are being handled. Typically in the blood, your acid or your base, no, is uncharged. Because they are neutral, they can easily enter the tubular cell, then out into the filtrate, primarily due to concentration gradient. No? Once in the filtrate, your acid can interact with a filtered bicarb. So the acid now will give off its hydrogen ion. It will now have a negative charge. So it is now in its ionic form or conjugate base. For your base, no, it goes out again through your tubular cell and out into the filtrate, neutral. Once inside the filtrate, it will now interact with a hydrogen ion. So your base now will be protonated. It will now have a positive charge. So your base now will be in its conjugate acid form. So take note that these neutral acids or bases, they are being driven via concentration gradient. Once inside the filtrate, they will now be in their ionic form. So they could be positively charged, no? So that's your conjugate acid, or negatively charged. So that's your conjugate base. Once they are in their ionic form, they will no longer be allowed to pass through the cell membrane. So if you will recall, the cell membrane do not readily allow charged particles to go through. That is diffusion trapping. No? A clinical application for diffusion trapping is when you have a patient with, let's say, salicylate toxicity. No? So when your patient has salicylate toxicity, meaning you have an overdose of aspirin, so the patient will now have metabolic acidosis. One way of treating these patients is to alkalinize the urine with sodium bicarb. Your salicylate, no, in its neutral form, once it goes to the kidneys, it will pass through the tubular cell, then out into the filtrate, and then it will encounter a filtered bicarb. So it will now give off its hydrogen ion. So your salicylate now becomes negatively charged. Since it is now charged, it will not be allowed to pass through the cell membrane. So your salicylate now will now be excreted. So this is one way of treating salicylate toxicity. No? So that's your diffusion trapping. So now let's go to the different segments of the nephron. So again, we'll go through each segment. So first, you have your proximal convoluted tubule. So for your proximal convoluted tubule, typically this is where majority of secretion happens. So this is where your hydrogen ions, your drugs, your acids and bases are being secreted. So let's look at how these substances are being handled. So again, everything begins with your sodium-potassium pump. No? So in this case, your sodium hydrogen antiporter here, which is your secondary active transport, will promote secretion of hydrogen. No? In the PCT, this is also where your organic cations are being handled. So again, this is the blood, this is the filtrate. So everything begins with your sodium-potassium pump. Now, as the pump drives sodium out, no, that will make the interior of the cell more negative, so around negative 70 millivolts. So that negative charge will attract an organic cation. So your organic cation can easily diffuse through the cell membrane, or it can utilize your organic cation transporter. Once your organic cation is inside the cell, it can either go out, no, through or to the filtrate via your multi-drug resistant 1 protein or your organic cation exchanger here. No? So your cation goes out in exchange for your hydrogen. So take note that these transporters serve as your secondary active transport mechanisms. So they will not depend on the activity of your primary pump. For your anions, the mechanism is still similar. So here, everything starts with your primary pump. Sodium goes out. So that will create a sodium gradient that will power another secondary active transport. This time, this is your sodium dicarboxylate transporter. Here, sodium enters because of the gradient established by your primary pump. As sodium enters, alpha-ketoglutarate enters with it. So the concentration of your alpha-ketoglutarate increases inside the cell, much higher compared to that in the interstitium here. So that gradient will drive your organic anion transporter 1 and your organic anion transporter 3. So alpha-ketoglutarate goes out in exchange for an organic anion. So if you will notice, sodium and your alpha-ketoglutarate are simply being recycled. At the end of it all, you have transport of your organic anion from the blood into your tubular cell. So your anion inside the cell increases. So with the gradient present, this is your filtrate, that gradient can drive the organic ion to be transported out into the filtrate via a multi-resistant or multi-drug resistant protein 2 or via your organic anion transporter 4. So here, your anion is pumped out in exchange for alpha-ketoglutarate. No? So that's how some of your anions are being handled, or your organic anions. So here are a few examples. So take note, in the proximal convoluted tubule, this is where majority of secretion happens. Now, the filtrate passes through the loop of Henle. In the descending limb, only water is reabsorbed. But in the ascending limb, namely in the thick ascending limb, there you have your sodium hydrogen antiporter or counter transport. So again, this is a secondary active transport powered by your primary pump. So as sodium is being reabsorbed, hydrogen is being secreted. Now we enter the distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct. So we've already talked about this. With the presence of aldosterone, potassium secretion occurs. So again, everything begins with your primary pump. And as the principal cell activity increases, this can also increase the activity of your alpha intercalated cell. So as more and more potassium is being secreted, more potassium is being made available for your alpha intercalated cell. So potassium enters in exchange for hydrogen. So here, hydrogen is being secreted. So this is how we quantify rate of secretion. So take note, if your filtered load is is less than your excretion rate, then net secretion has occurred. So a classic example of this would be creatinine. Now let's talk about the glomerulotubular balance. Now the glomerulotubular balance is an interesting phenomenon. This basically increases the rate of reabsorption as the tubular load increases. Meaning to say, if you increase the load, no, of a particular substance in the filtrate, then the rate of reabsorption increases. So for example, let's look at sodium. If glomerular filtration rate increases, then the filtered load of sodium increases. So you now have more sodium present in the filtrate. Now, because of your tubuloglomerular balance, this would mean that the reabsorption rate for sodium will increase. So this will now more or less regulate or control the amount of sodium going to the macula densa. So how does this happen? So let's look at sodium. So for example, if hydrostatic pressure is high, if glomerular hydrostatic pressure is high, then the filtration rate increases. Then the filtration rate of sodium increases. So you now have more sodium present in the filtrate. So how does increased reabsorption rate happens? So remember, if glomerular filtration rate is high, this would mean that, let's say if renal plasma flow is still the same, your filtration fraction increases. The filtration fraction increases. So you increase now the oncotic pressure present in the plasma. And this will now go through the efferent arteriole into the peritubular capillaries or vasa recta. So take note that in the vasa recta or in the peritubular capillaries, because of a high filtration fraction, oncotic pressure is high. This will impart increased reabsorption. So that's the first factor. The second factor is your gradient time limitation for the handling of sodium. So if you will remember, if you increase the filtered load of sodium and you compare the amount of sodium in the filtrate, no, compared to your tubular cell, the high amounts of sodium present in the filtrate will favor faster rate of reabsorption because of your gradient time limitation. So that increases now the reabsorption of sodium. And if you will recall your various transporters, no, sodium is not the only substance that is being reabsorbed. As sodium is being reabsorbed, other substances must go with it, like your glucose, your amino acids, or even the secretion of certain substances like your metabolites. So that's how glomerulotubular balance works. No? Now, the main purpose of your glomerulotubular balance is to more or less regulate or control the amount of sodium reaching the macula densa. Because if you will recall, changes or fluctuations in sodium concentration, when this is detected by the macula densa, can activate the tubuloglomerular feedback mechanism. So essentially, your glomerulotubular balance and your tubuloglomerular feedback, they are important not just for renal autoregulation of renal blood flow and glomerular filtration rate, but it is also important for the regulation of the amount of sodium going into the macula densa or going to the macula densa. No? So again, for the calculation of your reabsorption and secretion rates, you need to take note of their respective formulas. No? So here, reabsorption is the filtered amount minus your excreted amount, whereas your amount secreted is equal the amount excreted minus the amount filtered.